We hope that you'll find this very interesting, informative, and we're trying very hard to leave time for questions at the end. So let's begin. Judaism can trace its connection to vaccines, its initial encounter with vaccines, to Europe just over 200 years ago. At the end of the 18th century, smallpox in Europe was common, contagious, and often deadly. As Dr. Najera mentioned yesterday, in England, Edward Jenner realized that certain individuals who contracted cowpox seemed immune to smallpox. In 1796, he tested his idea by inoculating a young boy with pus scraped from a local milkmaid who contracted cowpox. Later, he injected the boy with smallpox matter, but the lad never became infected. News of Jenner's success spread rapidly. Those who know their English history know that there were exceptionally few, if any, Jews in England in the late 18th century. There were, however, a great number of Jews in Eastern Europe at that time, including in what is now Ukraine. The Jews of the town of Bratslav, located 1,500 miles east of London, were led by a young Hasidic master, a Rebbe Nachman. Rebbe Nachman heard of Jenner's success, and he issued a mandate. He required that all infants over 3 months old be inoculated. Now, why did Rebbe Nachman issue his mandate? I'll give you some clues. It was not because he had compelling data from the local Institute of Health about the safety and efficacy of the procedure. And it was not because local drug companies provided assurance about manufacturing and product integrity. In addition to hearing anecdotal evidence about Jenner's success, Rebbe Nachman was motivated primarily by Jewish values. The Jewish values that informed Rebbe Nachman were the product of text and experience. The foundational text of the Jewish people is the Torah, which means instruction. Some of you may know it as the 5 books of Moses. These passages from the Torah may be familiar to you. From Genesis, God created humankind in God's own image. From Leviticus, you shall keep these laws and rules and live by them. You shall not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And from Deuteronomy, choose life. These precepts may not be as familiar to you. From Deuteronomy, take exceeding care of yourself, and you shall make a parapet around the roof of your house. The Talmud is a collection of commentaries from the first millennium of the Common Era. Here we find 2 concepts that reinforce one another. The overriding principle is that of pikuach nefesh. It holds that all of the commandments, laws, regulations, and rules of Judaism, with 3 exceptions not relevant here, can be disregarded to save a life. And in a bit of poetic hyperbole, we also find in the Talmud the understanding that if anyone were to take a life, it would be as if he took a whole world. But if anyone were to save a life, it would be as if he saved a whole world. Subsequent rabbinic interpretations in the Middle Ages emphasized the importance of guarding one's own health and guarding against disease. For instance, the 12th century physician Maimonides and the 16th century legal scholar Joseph Caro both stated that Jews have a religious obligation to use proactive measures to protect against a foreseeable harm to themselves or to others. These texts and traditions can be boiled down to 2 fundamental responsibilities that all Jews have. One is for self-care, and the other is to sustain one another. So we should not be surprised that when faced with the foreseeable harm of infectious disease, Rebbe Nachman mandated vaccinations. We should not be surprised that he selected a then modern parapet of sorts, put in use here to guard against an anticipated danger. And we should not be surprised that he wrote, "We must be careful about the health of children. Whoever does not vaccinate every baby against smallpox, he is like one who sheds blood. The values that motivated Rabbi Nachman over 2 centuries ago motivate Jews of all denominations today, resulting in overwhelming, if not universal, support for government-mandated vaccines. After all, the Talmud also says, Dina de Malchuta Dina, the law of the land is the law. Writing for the conservative movement about compulsory immunization in Jewish parochial or day schools, Rabbi Joseph Prouser surveyed the history of Jewish opinion on vaccinations and concluded that there is, in the Jewish tradition, a well-established preference for preventive medicine as a religious mandate, and a failure to immunize, he said, is a serious compound violation of Jewish law. He added, there is no basis in Jewish law to support a request for a religious exemption from state-mandated immunization. I repeat, no basis in Jewish law to support a request for a religious exemption. And Reform and Reconstructionist scholars have reached similar conclusions. Despite this consensus, there has been some hesitancy and some resistance to vaccines and vaccination mandates in certain subsections of the larger Jewish community. Part of this minority attitude may be based on a particular feature of Jewish law and is relatively easy to address. Part of this attitude, however, is grounded in matters more complex. We'll look at the challenge on principle first. From time to time, some Jews have raised particular concerns about the ingredients in vaccines. The usual basis for this concern derives from the Torah's classification of some animals as kosher, that is, fit for consumption, and others as not fit. For instance, cows are fit and pigs are not. You can find the ingredients for approved vaccines on the CDC website, and there you will see that some vaccines contain pig cells. Why pork? Because the gelatin derived from pork is sometimes used as a stabilizer in flu and other vaccines. However, according to authorities on kashrut, that is the rules and practices of all things kosher, the perceived problem largely goes away because kashrut only applies to substances that are consumed. It does not apply to substances that are administered by injection, by nasal spray, or in the form of creams or ointments or suppositories. In short, any objection to the administration of a non-oral vaccine on kashrut grounds would not be warranted. And the only legitimate objection based on kashrut then could be to oral vaccines. But even there, in the absence of an alternative treatment, and the number of offending cells is generally considered to be de minimis. And besides, the overriding principle of pekuach nefesh should apply. The more difficult challenge we have with respect to vaccine hesitancy is a communal one. It is based on an attitude that is based not on any commandment or text, but one that arises in certain Orthodox communities, especially in the close-knit and self-protective group of Jews known as the Haredim. These are Jews who are religiously engaged and whose lifestyle is typified by large families in densely populated areas, and who sometimes distinguish themselves from other groups by language and by dress. Crucially, they engage in numerous significant communal activities, including group prayer 3 times daily and Sabbath meals for extended families. Their insular communities are also places where measles outbreaks occurred in 2018 and 19, and places that were disproportionately affected by COVID in 2020. And more recently, this past July, in one such community in New York, the first case of polio in a decade in the United States was reported. The polio vaccination rate in that particular community being only 42%, the lowest in the state of New York. Perhaps particularly interesting for a conference like this We now have at least 2 studies which demonstrate both the challenges of communicable diseases, and especially among tight-knit religious communities, and the role that Jewish values and practices can have and have played in mitigating the danger of transmission in such communities. One study, known as the Mitzvah Cohort Study, looked at over 9,500 Jews, Orthodox Jews, in various communities in 12 states, and how they were impacted in March 2020, at which time Jews around the world were celebrating the holiday of Purim, gathering in synagogues and socially interacting to provide gifts and food to members of the community. This was also a time, you may remember, early in our understanding of the COVID pandemic, well before ideas about physical distancing and mask wearing were promoted. The much smaller study, which I call the NYU study, sought to understand communal knowledge and attitudes about COVID-19 and vaccines in New York Haredi communities. Information for this study was gathered later than that of the Mitzvah study, specifically in December 2020 and January of 2021. The results of both surveys were consistent with the fact that infections were higher in these socially and culturally bonded communities than in neighboring areas. The NYU study added an historical and sociological perspective. It noted that prior to the recent measles outbreak, the percentage of those vaccinated in the surveyed communities was less than 15%, and that the efforts of New York officials to increase vaccinations were viewed as curtailing individual liberties and threatening the integrity of the community. All of this information leads to the question of how we should handle a Jewish objector to a vaccine mandate. Those who object to vaccine mandates largely do so for one of 3 reasons. They may have received misinformation and reject the science behind the vaccine. They may claim that their objection is based on some religious principle. They may be acting inconsistent with what they perceive the norm is of their cohort. That is, not vaccinating may be a marker of group identity. And as discussed in his book, The Righteous Mind, NYU professor Jonathan Haidt points out that religion can bind and it can also blind. Fortunately, both of these studies I have referenced also contain helpful information about how certain insular Jewish communities function. The Mitzvah Cohort Study, albeit without any citations, stated that before government and other restrictions on mass gatherings were put in place in the spring of 2020, Orthodox rabbis and leadership organizations were already developing culturally sensitive policies relating to religious services and gatherings. To learn more, I called one of the authors of this study, Dr. Avi Rosenberg, who's affiliated with Johns Hopkins. And Dr. Rosenberg told me of creative ways during the pandemic that prayer quorums were achieved, that religious teachings were home delivered, and perhaps most remarkably, that 8-week overnight summer camps for over 25,000 kids were operated while secular camps were closed. The NYU study asked specifically who survey participants trusted the most and the least for medical information. State and local health departments and major secular news and social media outlets ranked at the bottom of the list. The most trusted sources were a personal physician, an Orthodox physician network, and a rabbi or other religious authority. Reporting following the recent polio scare noted another interesting point of interest. While economic and political decisions in the Orthodox community tend to be made by men, health decisions were made by women, and they were reportedly knowledgeable and proactive. So I finished with these thoughts. Members of insular communities who object to vaccines are not necessarily doing so as a result of critical thinking, but may be engaged in a kind of motivated reasoning, wanting to act in a manner consistent with the customs of their group. If there's to be a chance at successful persuasion, it will more likely come from an understanding about the concerns the objector has, and an appeal from a trusted source to the values that the objector shares with the public health community. Those values may be one or a combination of the values discussed earlier. For example, vaccines and masks too can be seen as modern parapets which help protect us directly, and through the creation of herd immunity also guard the elderly and immunocompromised among us with protection they would not otherwise have. The values first approach may lead a religiously observant objector to understand that accepting a vaccination is an important way to fulfill the objector's twin responsibilities of self-care and sustaining one another. And hopefully the objector may also come to realize how many worlds can be saved by getting a nice Jewish shot.
Good morning. I'm Kathy Curran, and I am with the Catholic Health Association of the United States. We're a membership organization. We represent about 650 hospitals and another 1,200 or so nursing homes and other Catholic health facilities across the country. I was listening to Roger's remarks, and a lot of what he said about the biblical basis for position on vaccine applies as well. I'm going to get in a moment into more about how Catholics assess vaccines from a moral perspective. But Catholic hospitals were formed largely by Catholic sisters in the United States, beginning in the mid-1700s. And they were motivated by the healing ministry of Jesus Christ. That's what they saw themselves as doing, continuing the healing ministry of Jesus Christ. Healing is an incredibly important value for the Catholic health ministry and for the church as a whole. And I think that's an important background piece to remember when we're talking about vaccines and vaccine mandates. CHA has been fairly active in COVID, in terms of COVID and the vaccines. We put out a statement early on about what we thought were principles for ethical and appropriate development and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. We're concerned not only with how the vaccine was produced, making sure it was produced in a morally appropriate way, but also making sure that the vaccine was available and accessible to people in this country and domestically, making sure that the populations that were most impacted by COVID-19 had immediate and ready access to vaccination, whether that be the people who were in healthcare and in other essential services, or communities within the United States that we know were hit particularly hard by the impact of COVID-19. We also are one of 60 Catholic organizations that formed something called the Catholic Cares Coalition, which is dedicated to making sure that there is vaccine access in the United States and domestically for everyone. We have a bunch of programs focusing on advocacy, focusing on making sure that there's the United States is sharing its vaccine resources with countries that need vaccine access, and then also working mostly in California with projects, local grants in communities to make sure that vaccine information is provided in culturally appropriate ways and language appropriate ways so that we can reach out to as many people as possible. So you can put us on the side of liking vaccines. But I want to talk a little bit about the Catholic moral considerations on vaccines, mandates, and exemptions. At the risk of oversimplifying, I'm going to start with a quick summary, and then I'll try to unpack as much of it as I can in about 15 minutes. So from the Catholic perspective, I would say there is something very close to a moral obligation to receive a COVID-19 vaccination. In principle, the government is within its rights to establish mandates, and in principle, mandates should allow exemptions for conscience reasons. So let me unpack all of that. Where do Catholics turn for guidance on the question of vaccines? Well, the Catholic Church has a long tradition of ethical and moral teaching rooted in the Bible. Some of the Old Testament scripture that Roger, or the Hebrew Testament scripture that Roger shared, and then passages in the New Testament, the example of Christ, as I said, in a healing ministry, and his call to care for others. But throughout the millennia since then, the church has developed a rich body of social, ethical, and moral teaching. I want to point out two particular streams. One is Catholic social doctrine on human dignity and the common good in society, and the other are principles of moral theology and bioethics, in particular the principle of cooperation with evil, which is an analytical structure to look at whether one's own actions contribute in some way, even remotely, to another's wrongdoing in a way that would render your own actions themselves morally problematic. And these principles have been articulated throughout the time through various papal and Vatican documents, as well as statements by bishops. So there's the whole body of Catholic social teaching reaches back to a statement by Pope Leo XIII in 1891 called Rerum Novarum, which was really the first time that a pope in the Catholic Church looked at social conditions and applied Catholic moral principles to conditions in society, looking at the condition of labor as society transformed from an agricultural society into a largely industrial society, all the way up through Laudato Si, which was promulgated by St. Francis, got ahead of myself, not St. Francis, Pope Francis, in 2015, Care for Our Common Home, focusing on largely ecological issues. Several principles arise. I've mentioned two already that are relevant, the doctrine on human dignity and common good in society. There's also an important theme of balancing rights and responsibilities. So recognizing that people have rights, but they also have responsibilities at the same time. The option for the poor and vulnerable we ought always to consider how our actions are going to impact those who are poor. Justice, all very important principles. Some of the recent documents that have come out that are relevant to our current situation from the Vatican, in 2005, the Pontifical Academy for Life issued a document on moral reflections on vaccines prepared from cells derived from human aborted fetuses. In 2008, the CDF, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, put out an instruction on dignitatis personae, also looking at a range of issues related to abortion. In December of 2020, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith put out a note on the morality of using some anti-COVID-19 vaccines. And in December of 2020, also, there was a commission established by the Vatican on COVID-19, and that commission, together with the Pontifical Academy for Life, put out 20 questions on vaccines. And a side note, a Vatican congregation is sort of like a cabinet agency. And the Pontifical Academy of Life is somewhat analogous to a Vatican think tank. So these are authoritative bodies within the Vatican. So that's where Catholics turn to look to make their analysis about the morality of taking or not taking a vaccine. What does the Church have to say about vaccines in general and COVID-19 in particular? At the very abstract level, I'd say vaccines are morally neutral. They're neither forbidden nor mandatory as a moral matter. They're a tool for healthcare. Looking at a particular instance, I think that you would look at, to determine the morality of vaccination, the duty to protect one's own health, the duty to protect the common good, and the provenance of the particular vaccine in question, how it was made, is it safe, is it effective? The sanctity of human life, the dignity of every person, is the foundational principle in Catholic social teaching. It gives rise to the obligation to preserve one's own health. It also demands that we have a duty of care for others, for our neighbors, and for the common good of society. So when we're deciding whether to receive a vaccine or not, a Catholic must consider not only whether it will protect their own health, but how their vaccination status might affect others. Perhaps you're young and healthy and not worried about getting sick, but you also have to consider the good of those who aren't or can't be vaccinated, maybe because of age, maybe because of medical issues, maybe because of access issues, and you have a responsibility to be vaccinated to help create herd immunity, to protect those who cannot be vaccinated and may be vulnerable. With COVID, of course, we had to also consider that you could be asymptomatic. You might not even know you had it and still be contagious. As the US bishops said in their December 2020 statement on COVID vaccines, getting vaccinated can be seen as an act of charity towards others, part of our moral responsibility for the common good. I'm going to take a quick personal note. I never got a flu vaccine in my life until COVID, because I was one of those people who said, I never get sick. I don't get the flu. Why should I get a vaccine? But it was through COVID I realized, because I could be giving it to other people. So there is an obligation to think about the effect of your vaccine status on other people. The Church's statements on vaccines originally arose from controversy over requirements that children receive vaccination against rubella, German measles, and the chickenpox in order to attend schools. There were mandates in both public schools and Catholic schools. So the issue arose because both the rubella and the chickenpox vaccine are made in a process that uses human cell lines that were derived from aborted fetal tissue. Abortions that occurred in the 60s and 70s, and some subsequent lines were developed from abortions or fetal tissue that was acquired in the 80s, although the origin of the fetal tissue was somewhat up in the air. The question that some had and put to bishops in the Vatican, were those vaccines morally illicit? And could parents refuse to vaccinate their children? So I assume everyone here is familiar with the Church's position on a direct or elective abortion, so you understand why this was an issue, and why the use of vaccines produced in reliance on material from aborted fetuses can raise serious moral concerns. Is using, to refer back to the analysis that I referred to earlier, an analysis around the principle of cooperation of evil, is using a vaccine which is connected to a prior, even remote evil act itself an evil act? That was a question people had. Now, we live in a morally complex world, and that's what this principle of the cooperation of evil is meant to address. It's very difficult to get through a day without touching something that the production of which is somehow morally implicated. The US Department of Labor in 2020 put out a list of 200 goods made with child and or forced labor: tobacco, coffee, cocoa, cell phones. So it's very difficult to be 100% morally pure in this world. So how do you navigate? How do you decide what's appropriate for you to do and not to do? The principle of cooperation with the evil is a way to analyze the proximity or remoteness of one's own action to another's evil act. I could go on and give a 20-minute, 30-minute lecture just on that, but I'll stop there. Just footnote that and let you know it's there. The gist of the Vatican guidance in the rubella and chickenpox cases was this: that using vaccines grown on compromised cell lines does raise moral issues, and Catholics should seek out alternatives that don't use those stem cells if they are available. But given the remoteness of the connection with the original abortion, if there's no effective alternative vaccine in the face of grave danger to one's health and the health of others, it is morally illicit to receive the vaccine. Turning to COVID-19, the two most common vaccines in the United States have an even more remote connection to the problematic cell lines. Pfizer and Moderna, of course, are based on mRNA technology. They don't contain the virus itself, so they weren't grown on any kind of stem cell line. But once produced, they were tested using a compromised cell line. And it's worth noting that hundreds and hundreds of over-the-counter and prescription drugs are similarly tested, things like Tylenol and Advil. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, a little bit more problematic because it was grown on a compromised cell line. But people don't always have a choice of which vaccine to take. And so, as the Vatican document said in the earlier case, using the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is certainly morally illicit. The Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith in December 2020 wrote, when ethically irreproachable COVID-19 vaccines are not available, it is morally acceptable to receive COVID-19 vaccines that have used cell lines from aborted fetuses in their research and production process. So the Vatican and the bishops have been, are saying, and the things I've quoted, that there's not a moral problem with receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. It's morally licit, but is it mandatory? So now we need to look at some of the Catholic moral considerations on vaccine mandates. The first question, of course, would be the moral status of the vaccine itself, which we've already discussed. It is morally appropriate and fine to get a COVID-19 vaccine. But remember, the original question around German measles and chickenpox arose in the context of school mandates. So that also raised the issue of the rights of parents to make decisions about their children. Catholic teaching takes very seriously the rights of parents to raise and educate their children as they see fit. It's not an absolute right. Remember, before I said there are rights and responsibilities, but it is one that demands respect. For example, a parent must consider the safety and efficacy of a medical treatment, any side effects, and make a judgment about whether they believe it is appropriate for the child. So in the early days when the vaccine first became available for children, I think a lot of parents waited a little while because they were a little uncertain about what the side effects might be. So that, I think that's an example of a parents wanting to exercise their right to be 100% sure about, or as close as they can be, about the health impacts for their children. Catholic teaching, but as I said, Catholic teaching also requires us to act for the common good of society and others, and society has the responsibility of balancing the various freedoms in a way that promotes the common good. So the Church would recognize the right, indeed the responsibility and principle of government to establish mandates when necessary to protect the health of people. I'll point out here that the Vatican had a mandate. I just read they've loosened it up in the last few months because as the pandemic is, I won't say going away, but transmission has gone down. But for a while, the Vatican had a mandate for anybody entering Vatican City. They had to show vaccine proof of vaccination. The other thing to consider is the Church also places a priority on the exercise and protection of individual conscience. It takes the formation of a proper conscience seriously. Now, conscience in this context is not a synonym for sort of what I feel like doing or what's convenient for me. It assumes a serious inquiry of self-informed, both in the facts and the moral considerations, that leads one to a well-formed moral conclusion. Sometimes ignorance or bad judgment can lead to an improperly formed conscience. Nonetheless, a person must follow what they believe to be morally right, even if they are in error. But they must also accept the responsibility for the consequences of that decision and that action. So the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in December 2020 wrote, those who, however, for reasons of conscience, refuse vaccines produced with cell lines from aborted fetuses must do their utmost by other prophylactic means and appropriate behavior to avoid becoming vehicles for transmission. A Dominican priest, Father Nicanor Austriaco, who is both a scientist and a theologian, put it more bluntly. Persons of conscience should be free to refuse vaccination against COVID-19, even if they live in a society with community spread of their disease. However, their community should also be free to protect the common good by not permitting them to enter schools, restaurants, malls, airports, and other public spaces where they may unwittingly catch or spread the disease. And I want to emphasize that both the CDF and Father Austriaco made those statements at the end of very long documents urging essentially everyone to get vaccinated and why concerns about association with aborted fetuses should not stop anyone from getting a vaccine. So how is this played out as a practical matter? How have Catholics, bishops, priests, lay people responded? As I said, Catholic hospitals and CHA, as well as Catholic hospitals, parishes and other Catholic social service agencies have been very active in providing access to vaccine. My own employer required vaccination in order to remain employed. Bishops and dioceses have urged their people to get vaccinated. The Catholic bishops and the bishops of California, the California Catholic Conference issued a statement strongly encouraging Catholics to receive COVID-19 vaccination for the sake of themselves, their loved ones, and the common good. So I think there's wide support for vaccines. I think there's agreement that the moral connection between the vaccine and the problematic cell line is so remote that it should not pose any moral roadblock to anyone. Nonetheless, there are some people who may feel that that connection is too close for them. We've seen, you've probably read about form letters being put out there that people could fill out to try to get an exemption from their employer for mandates. Some bishops a few bishops, I don't want to say too many, a few bishops are facilitating that. I'd say more bishops have instructed their priests not to participate in that. So I think that gives you a flavor of kind of where the Catholic Church, how the Catholic Church approaches the question of vaccines. We urge people to get vaccinated. We support the vaccine. We support the concept of mandates. We support the mandate for vaccination, but we also would recognize the role for exemptions for conscience protection in certain circumstances. So that's what I have to offer, and I look forward to getting your questions. Thanks.
This would be the time for Sheikh Omar to join us.
Thank you. Should I get started?
Please do.
Okay. Let me just share my presentation here and make sure we're good to go. There we go. Let's see. Okay. Let me do this. Begin. There we go. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to present Islam's stance on vaccines. I'll begin with the idea of the Sharia. The word Sharia it refers to basically the way of life that has been prescribed by God, or we say in Arabic, Allah. And every Muslim is supposed to live their life, every aspect of their life, according to the Sharia, which is basically the way that God has prescribed for us and wants us to live our life. Now, if we talk about the Sharia, we talk about the way in which we're supposed to be concluding every single transaction or action in our lives, we look at the sources of that Sharia. And the sources are the Quran and the Sunnah, or the Hadith. So the Quran is the revelation, it's the book that was given to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And the Sunnah, or the Hadith, are basically the statements and teachings of the Prophet Muhammad that are not directly part of the Quran. So they're like the supplementary teachings. So basically, anytime you want to know whether something is part and parcel of Islam, or it's some part of a cultural or something like that, the difference between the two is you check if it's in the Quran or if it's in the Sunnah or Hadith, then it can be part of Islam. If it's not there, then generally it's going to be something doesn't have a sound basis or grounding in Islam. So these two sources, though, they don't talk about vaccines. So you won't find a single verse in the Quran that says anything about a vaccine directly. You won't find a single statement or teaching of the Prophet Muhammad talking about vaccines. So what do? Well, what you do is these sources are going to be interpreted by experts and scholars. And what happens is they produce a body of knowledge called fiqh. And fiqh is like the human understanding of trying to figure out what the Sharia is. So if the Sharia is what God wants us to do, then fiqh is the human understanding of trying to figure out what God wants us to do in the absence of him exactly saying something specific or clear-cut, either in the Quran or in the teachings of the Prophet. So what's going to happen is the scholars who are interpreting these texts, they're going to come from very different scientific backgrounds. They're going to have different life experiences. They're going to have different levels of skepticism based, depending on whatever circumstances that they've had in their own life. So they may give a verdict that's based on the information that's been presented to them about vaccines. They may also give a verdict that's based upon their own lens, the way in which they view the world, the way in which they view texts. And that's going to result in what's called a fatwa. And a fatwa in Islam is basically a religious verdict where a scholar, an expert is saying, based on our reading of these texts, based on our reading of the Quran, based on our reading of the teachings of the Prophet, the Sunnah or Hadith, we believe that God would have wanted us to do X or Y or Z. So that results in a fatwa, right? So what you're going to find is you're going to find different fatwas or different verdicts from Muslim legal scholars on some issues. You're not going to find a difference on pork, whether you can consume pork or alcohol, or that you have to pray 5 times a day, or that you fast in the month of Ramadan, or that pilgrimage is, to Mecca, or that interest giving or taking is forbidden in Islam. You're not going to find differences on that. But on something like vaccines, you will find some level of differences of opinion because it's not 100% clear cut. Rather, it's being derived from certain principles. Now, these fatwas that are given, they're going to influence Muslims around the world. And there's about 2 billion Muslims in the world today. It's almost, about a fourth of the population, or getting to a fourth of the population. So these fatwas influence Muslims in different ways, even in the most conservative, quote unquote, conservative or ultra conservative of places. Give you an example. In Saudi Arabia, you find that many of the Muslims are very accepting of vaccines when it comes to their children, just vaccines in general. You take a study of Pakistan as an example, also considered to be, fairly conservative Muslim country, Muslim majority country, and they tended to be very critical of the polio vaccine because of the information that was available to them, because of some incidents that happened with the polio vaccine, and because of the scholars issuing fatwas in that area about vaccines. So you can't really take a part of the Muslim world and say, well, they're of a particular religious bent, and therefore they're going to have this stance on vaccines. And then another one is from another region, and they have a different principle, on vaccines. So these are fatwas, and this is the work of scholars and kind of what their conclusions are and how it influences different Muslim populations throughout the world. Let's talk about the principle of harm. So when dealing with vaccines in particular, there is a principle of harm that is mentioned in the Sharia, in Islamic law, or what we call in fiqh when you talk about the human production of trying to understand what Islamic law is. This principle of harm is based on a teaching or a statement of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he said, do not cause harm and do not get harmed. In Arabic, it's la darar wa la dirar. Pretty simple statement. And this is the source. The source is in the Muwatta of Imam Malik. This is the number of the text. So this is a pretty simple principle. Don't harm anybody else, but don't let yourself get harmed either. So if you take an example like vaccines, scholars go and take a principle like this, and they say, okay, how do we apply this? How did the Prophet apply this in his own lifetime? So I'll give you an example of how the Prophet applied this. He said in another narration, he said, the right of preemption is valid in every joint property, but when the land is divided and the way is demarcated, then there is no right of preemption. So this is a hadith. This is part of the Sunnah. This is one of the ways in which the Prophet Muhammad made this new rule on an issue. Preemption is basically, if you have a property and you have two partners next to, two partners in a company, and they're selling a part of a land, the other partner has the right to buy that land first. Or if you have a neighbor and you have adjacent property, it's directly connected, the other person is going to have the right to purchase that before it goes on sale in the market. Why? What's the reason? Is because the potential harm that's going to result to the partner would be significant enough to make sure that you give them the first option to purchase, based on the principle that was just mentioned. So what happens is, based on the same thing, that scholars say, okay, this is how the Prophet applied the principle. How do we apply the same principle when it comes to new issues like vaccines? And this principle is highly emphasized when it comes to discussing about what type of harm is going to result when we don't take the vaccine, what type of potential harm is going to result, or side effects or potential side effects if you do take the vaccine, if you have some pre-existing condition or you have some allergy to one of the ingredients or something like that. So that's the general principle that scholars are going to be using. And when it comes to the principle of harm, if something is inevitable, they came up with a sub-principle. It's called a legal maxim. It's called the principle of choosing the lesser of two harms, right? So basically called ikhtiyar akhaf ad-dararain, meaning that if you have two harms available in front of you, you still are going to try to avert the one that's going to be the greater harm and pick the one that has the least harm. Pretty simple, but it's something that's been applied across the board in books on Islamic law for the last 1400 years. The second issue on vaccines was when it comes to the ingredients, as one of the other speakers mentioned, that there are some ingredients that would be prohibited in the religion of Islam. So how does this play a role? There's a verse in the Quran which says, therefore, O believers, eat of the lawful and good things that Allah has provided for you and be grateful for his favors, if it is true that you only worship him. Indeed, Allah has forbidden for you that which dies of itself. Basically carrion or dead meat, something that was like, let's say, roadkill or an animal fell off a mountain or something like that, that's prohibited for Muslims to consume. And then blood. So blood in and of itself, that's gone outside, not like a steak, a little bit blood left in there, but, blood that has been separated from an animal, just consuming blood in and of itself, and the flesh of swine, right? So that is the verse, one of the verses which talks about, forbidden ingredients. And that becomes an issue for vaccines because sometimes a vaccine can have porcine trypsin, it could have porcine gelatin, there could be remnants of dead animals, there could be some blood used in the production process. So you will find some fatwas and some Muslims saying, hey, we cannot take this vaccine because it's entering into our body, whether it's consumed through our mouth or it's going in through an injection somewhere. We're not supposed to have this stuff inside of our system. The response to that is two principles that many Muslim scholars have adhered to, and that is called istihala and istihlak. Istihala basically means transformation, and istihlak means dilution. Basically, it's based on this principle of, vinegar used to be made from wine, and Muslims cannot consume intoxicants at all. No marijuana, no alcohol, no beer, no wine, none of that stuff. Not even one sip. So what happens is that if you have wine and the wine transforms into vinegar, now it's not wine anymore, even though it was produced from wine. So this principle came out about if one substance transforms into a different substance, even if it came from something else that was prohibited, now it's going to be considered permissible for you to consume. And istihlak is in a similar category where you add so much of another component, you basically dilute that where there's such a small trace element of that thing, it has almost no effect on you. Based on these two principles, many scholars have said that the ingredients that will be contained in a vaccine or anything else that are either of such a small amount, or there's a hydrolysis that's taking place, there's a transformation of that small amount of substance that's taking place, it's not the same ingredients or the same element as it originally was in its final product. Therefore, it's not going to be impermissible for consumption by Muslims. Then we have the last principle, which is the principle of necessity. Principle of necessity is actually mentioned directly in the Quran itself. So the verse that I quoted to you about not eating pork and blood and all of that stuff, the verse that comes right after that verse in the Quran, it says, but whoever is compelled by necessity, meaning to eat any of those things like pork or blood or dead meat, not intending to sin or transgress by eating like a bunch of it more than you need, they will find Allah most forgiving and most merciful. So the basic principle is this, is that for a Muslim, if you're in the desert and you're starving and you have no other food and it just happens to be the only thing you have in front of you, is pork, and you got alcohol. It's like nothing else is available. This is the only thing you have. You are allowed to consume what's in front of you to save your life. So it becomes a principle of necessity. Now, there are three conditions of necessity that scholars have elucidated. One of them is that in order for necessity to function, the need has to be genuine. So let's say you're in a medical situation. It has to be a genuine problem that's resulting, in significant distress in your life if you don't consume this prohibited ingredient. And number two, it has to be proven to work. There has to be some level of certainty or probability that this is actually going to, eating this thing or consuming this thing is actually going to resolve the issue that you're having. And principle number three is there's no other alternative available that's going to have anywhere near the same amount of benefit or effect that's there. This is something that has been mentioned for pretty much 1400 years of Islamic law, going very far back. Here's a 17th century work on Islamic law that was compiled by over 500 Muslim scholars. I put a quote here for you, and I'll conclude with this. They said it is permissible for a severely sick person to drink blood and urine or consume the meat of a dead animal for the purpose of medication if an experienced Muslim medical expert states that it is the only cure and that one does not find any other alternative. Right? And this is in a book of fatawa, the plural of the word fatwa that I was just explaining to you. So just to show you that this is a principle that Muslims have applied for a very long time. Now, is there going to be consensus across the Muslim world for this? No. Muslims don't have one particular religious authority like a pope or a church that gives them the verdict and all of them need to follow it. So you do find levels of kind of independent scholars issuing different verdicts, maybe country by country, maybe movement by movement. So to find a way of uniting each and every single person is probably not going to be possible. So really it comes down to there is a lot of basis for having these exceptions, preventing harm of necessity, transformation, dilution, all of these things when it comes to vaccines in general. As for a mandate to ensure that, to say someone has absolutely no religious basis whatsoever for denying something like that, I think it would be difficult to enforce that upon each and every single person. So it comes back down to the amount of harm that's actually going to result versus the harm from everyone having their own right to their conscious and choosing their own way of following things. So hopefully that has given you a somewhat of a nutshell about what Islam says with regards to these things. All right. Well, thank you very much. And I look forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Umar. There's a lot of food for thought. Some of it may be forbidden food, but it was a lot of food for thought. Richard.
So now that we've heard the various faith perspectives, they've asked a lapsed Christian agnostic to provide some legal civil law context, as Roger said, on this topic. So I actually, interestingly, had the privilege early in my career of serving as a political appointee on the Arkansas State Board of Health. And we had the task of mandating vaccines on the board and determining exemption policy. And I called for, this was the end of my political career, called for a requirement for the HPV vaccine when that was a very new and unpopular opinion, and encountered the wrath of some legislators who objected to that on religious grounds and said, literally one of them said to me, "You're trying to make my daughter sexually promiscuous with this vaccine requirement," and tried to strip us of our authority to require vaccines. So what I would like to do, if I can get my notes up. It's not swiping open. Let me grab another device.
there's a Catholic Conference of Bishops puts on a social ministry gathering, a meeting every year, and we always have technical issues. We thought it was just a Catholic thing, but.
Thank you for that. My iPad will not swipe open. So I want to provide a historical and legal context on religious exemption policies. And I want to talk about some of the recent cases that have reached the lower courts and the Supreme Court that will be impactful as we think about vaccine mandates and religious exemptions going forward. You heard, I'm sure, this morning in the panel on the constitutionality of vaccine mandates about our holy grail in public health law, the Jacobson case. What I want to emphasize is that Jacobson was a minister himself, but he did not object to the mandate in Cambridge on religious grounds. So Jacobson was an immigrant from Sweden, where he had been subjected at 6 years old to a compulsory vaccination requirement for smallpox, and he had an adverse reaction. He believed that this was hereditary. His son also had an adverse reaction, and he was said to have a lifelong horror of the practice of vaccination. And so he came to the United States, he trained as a minister, became a Lutheran minister, went to Cambridge to establish a church, and 17 years before he arrived, Massachusetts had become the first state to enact a compulsory immunization requirement in the United States. And in the summer in 1901, there's a virulent strain of smallpox that caused an outbreak in Boston. And in the summer of the spring of 1902, at the time, local boards of health were very hands-on. They made rules, but they also enforced their rules. And the chair of the local board of health showed up on Jacobson's doorstep and said, "You need to be vaccinated." And he said, I'm not able to do that. I have this contraindication. And by the summer, they swore out a complaint, and he appeared before a court 6 days later and stated his objection. And then, of course, as we know, the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Jacobson did firmly establish the ability of states to exercise the police powers to compel people to be vaccinated. Justice John Marshall Harlan, writing for the court, said that restraints on individual liberty in our society are manifold, that disorder and anarchy would result if our rule of law in our society were based on a principle of every man to himself. Instead, our rights are subject to reasonable conditions. And holding that the state exercise of police powers to compel vaccination is not only lawful, but may override liberty interests, the court applied the equivalent of what we know today as rational basis scrutiny. So applying that test today would sound something like this. The state has a legitimate interest in preventing the spread of disease, and compulsory immunization is rationally related to that purpose, to that interest. While Reverend Jacobson did not assert a violation of his religious liberties, the court did indirectly address the matter. Justice Harlan wrote that a person may be compelled by force if need be against his will and without regard to his personal wishes or pecuniary interests or even his religious or political convictions to take up arms in defense of war under the sanction of the state for the purpose of protecting the public collectively. Health departments, not courts, he noted, decide the means of controlling outbreaks. And very important for our discussion today, the court stated that only fit subjects could be compelled to be vaccinated. Jacobson had not made his case. He appeared to be healthy and was thus a fit subject. And Jacobson ultimately paid his fine. Now, in the intervening period since Jacobson, we saw a case in 1922, Zoot v. King, where the court extended this reasoning to school entry requirements for vaccination. And essentially all states from 1922 through 1980 went on to enact school entry requirements for vaccination. What we didn't see during the intervening period was states enact broad compulsory laws applying to the entire adult population. We did not see that between smallpox and COVID. What we did see was that states enacted very specific requirements, immunization requirements for very specific populations. So whether that's students of higher education, patients in healthcare facilities, healthcare workers, daycare workers. So that was the type of adult compulsory law that we saw. And I wondered before the pandemic, could we see a situation where states would want to extend compulsory laws to all adults for certain routine immunizations? That was a pretty wacky thought before the pandemic. But then this public health threat obviously emerged, and we have seen the application of broad mandates to adults. So why not allow exemptions, right? There's a well-established link between exemptions and outbreaks. We've seen that with measles outbreaks in the United States. And for this reason, the AMA actually outright opposes religious exemptions to vaccine requirements. As required under Jacobson, every state today, all 50 states, allow medical exemptions. So if you're not a fit subject, if you have a contraindication, you can obtain a medical exemption. 44 states today permit religious exemptions, 15 states permit philosophical exemptions. We saw that number go down as states, after some measles outbreaks a number of years ago, realized that people were gaming the system with philosophical exemptions. And states actually have varied processes for how they allow individuals to obtain exemptions. I had the privilege, when I was at the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials, working with states that were trying to figure out ways, how do we actually limit the ability to obtain an exemption so that we can deter people? If they're really looking for an easy path just to get out of it, we want to deter that. We want them to actually opt to get vaccinated. Those policies really do vary significantly depending on the state. So over the years, we have seen controversies related to religious exemptions in the courts, and courts have actually decided on really interesting and novel grounds to overturn religious exemption laws. So the first case, the Mississippi Supreme Court in 1979, invalidated the state's religious exemption law on equal protection grounds. They said that most parents would not qualify for it, and that it would discriminate against the great majority of children whose parents have no such religious convictions. They also said that it would require most school children to attend school and be vaccinated at the same time, exposing them to the hazard of associating with unvaccinated children. And then likewise, in a case Boone v. Bozeman, an Arkansas Federal District Court in 2002 overturned that state's religious exemption law. They said that it violated the Establishment Clause because it had the purpose of furthering religion, and that it violated the Free Exercise Clause because it supported the religious rights within a recognized church or religious denomination. The legislature in Arkansas responded by enacting a philosophical exemption. So how does anyone, whether a state or an employer, go about addressing the sincerity of religious beliefs? First, what are the reasons given for religious objections? And I think we've heard that well covered today. And I would just recap that most organized religions support vaccination. I think that's what we've heard today. But just to give you a list, the Catholic Church is all for it. Christian denominations including Amish, Anglican, Baptist, Eastern Orthodox, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mennonite, Mormon, Pentecostal, Quaker, Seventh-day Adventist, and Unitarian Universalist denominations do not oppose vaccination. Countries that are predominantly Buddhist, Hindu, and Islamic do not prohibit vaccination. Judaism, as we've heard, supports vaccination. The Baha'i faith supports following public health guidelines, including vaccination. We do see some limited opposition in the Dutch Reformed Church among Christian Scientists and a handful of faith healing denominations. But these groups do not universally oppose vaccination. The Church of Christ emphasizes healing through prayer, but encourages its congregants to submit to the law. So where is all of this ostensibly religious objection coming from? As Dorit Rice has written, it is possible, if not common, to fake religious exemptions. And this has really come into the spotlight during COVID-19. So putting aside for a moment state mandates, employer mandates have also come into the spotlight during COVID. So under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, employers must give employees reasonable accommodations for religious beliefs. And according to the EEOC, Title VII protects all aspects of religious observance and practice, as well as belief, and defines religion very broadly. According to the EEOC, this includes religious beliefs that are new, uncommon, not part of a formal church or sect, only subscribed to by a small number of people, or that seem illogical or unreasonable to others. So employers have the option of addressing these objections in two ways. They can offer an exemption to provide for that accommodation. They can challenge in that process the sincerity of an employee's religious beliefs, asking them to justify those religious beliefs, and then they can deny the exemption if they choose or approve it. And they can also refuse on the basis that it causes undue hardship for the employer. And we've seen interesting developments in the courts related to this. So courts have been very reluctant to wade into questioning the sincerity of employee religious beliefs, but they do tend to look favorably, depending on the type of employer, on the undue hardship argument. And we've seen this with the Fifth Circuit, where the Fifth Circuit said, United Airlines workers who wanted an injunction because they were going to be sent home without pay, they did not find that there was an undue hardship, but they were more sympathetic when we were talking in a healthcare worker context. We saw that recently in oral arguments in a case before a Fifth Circuit panel. So coming back to the state mandate perspective, the Supreme Court has long held that laws singling out an individual on the basis of religious beliefs are doubtless unconstitutional. But government may burden those with sincerely held religious beliefs when a law is nonetheless neutral and generally applicable. Although if a federal law separately violates RFRA, that's a different question. But with respect to state law, that holds. So Justice Scalia, writing for the majority in a case called Employment Division v. Smith, held that the Free Exercise Clause permitted Oregon's prohibition of sacramental peyote use under the state's controlled substance laws. And he quoted Justice Felix Frankfurter in this opinion, stating that conscientious scruples have not, in the course of the long struggle for religious toleration, relieved the individual from obedience to a general law not aimed at the promotion or restriction of religious beliefs. The mere possession of religious convictions which contradict the relevant concerns of a political society does not relieve the citizen from the discharge of political responsibilities. Such a law need only be rationally related to a legitimate state interest. In our example today, again, compulsory vaccination is rationally related to the state's interest in preventing the spread of disease. Justice Gorsuch thinks differently. In the first case in almost a century, it was 99 years, the first vaccine case to come before the Supreme Court, Doe v. Mills, Maine enacted a healthcare worker immunization requirement, and they did not permit a religious exemption. Justice Gorsuch believes that the Maine law should be invalidated. By the way, the court did not reach a full merits review. He thinks that the Maine law should have been invalidated under a strict scrutiny application. As most of us know, most laws do not survive a strict scrutiny application. That requires a compelling state interest, and the law must be narrowly tailored and the least restrictive means for accomplishing its ends. Very difficult for a broad-based population health measure like a vaccine requirement to meet that test. But this is the test that he would have applied, and he would have struck down the Maine law. He says that, so the Jacobson court actually applied what we know as the equivalent of modern day rational basis scrutiny. These standards of review did not exist at the time of Jacobson, but it's recognizable as an application of rational basis scrutiny. Gorsuch claims that Jacobson would have survived the application of strict scrutiny. He said you could just opt out. As we know, the only opt-out was for fit subjects. He goes on to say, well, you could just simply pay a modest fine, $5, the equivalent of $140 today. So we have a Supreme Court justice just suggesting that you violate the law. So citing a case, Church of Lukumi, which was a case that involved a local ordinance that was targeting ritual animal sacrifice, but under the guise of an animal cruelty statute, he says that this law is not neutral or generally applicable, and that strict scrutiny should be applied. I don't find the comparability between a law that is intended, again, a broad-based public health measure, and the example in Church of Leucomene. No one is suggesting that we want to just go out and override religious interest. We're trying to prevent the spread of disease here. So rather than suggesting, though, that the Maine law was intended to target sincerely held religious beliefs, he does this sort of weighing of the medical exemption against the lack of a religious exemption. And he makes a mockery of the medical exemption process in Maine. He says, so the provider just has to sign a form. How easy is that? Now, admittedly, as I said, these processes vary in the states, and they may not always be as tight as they could be. But he says that that is a comparable secular activity. So what the court in Jacobson is saying is necessary. You can't force someone who's medically contraindicated to get vaccinated. Justice Gorsuch says is a comparable secular activity, and we're favoring that over religious beliefs. So we should take note that he also has asserted a difference in the state's interest in a pandemic versus a non-pandemic context that could have major implications for routine vaccine policy in the future. So I'll remind you that Jacobson was decided in a pandemic context, an outbreak context. There was a public health emergency. Zoot v. King in 1922, not an emergency context. It was a routine school entry requirement, but essentially the court extended the logic of Jacobson to this scenario where there's not an emergency, and so that's perfectly fine. The state has an interest here, and it would pass the rational basis test. Of course, in a separate case, Justice Gorsuch says, and this is in Roman Catholic Archdiocese, which involved New York State's restrictions on gatherings during COVID-19. He said that COVID-19 cannot qualify as such an interest forever. Even if the Constitution has taken a holiday during this pandemic, it cannot become a sabbatical. He contends that nothing in Jacobson purported to address, let alone approve, such serious and long-lasting intrusions into settled constitutional rights. But as we know, in Zoot v. King, it did. So I would therefore posit that Justice Gorsuch's overzealous attempt to apply strict scrutiny to vaccine policies ignores more than a century of settled law. Under these precedents, which applied standard equivalent to a modern-day rational basis scrutiny, states may adopt vaccine requirements without religious exemptions, and they may do so in an emergency or otherwise. But in essence, his message to states is tighten your medical exemptions or allow religious exemptions. But it may also be interpreted to say that states must always allow religious exemptions. Now, there's an imminent circuit split over this question. The Ninth Circuit, in upholding a school requirement in California without a religious exemption, found that this was a neutral and generally applicable law. To the contrary, there was a federal district court in Georgia that recently in the spring said that the military policy requiring vaccination that by policy allows for a religious exemption, but the fact that the military had not permitted any religious exemptions undermined that as a neutral and generally applicable law. So there is an emerging split here. And this was referenced in another case that came before the court, and certiorari was actually denied by the court in Hochul, Dr. A.V. Hochul. So if you recall, New York State promulgated a similar requirement to Maine for healthcare worker vaccination and did not allow a religious exemption. Governor Cuomo, before the policy was promulgated, said, we will allow a religious exemption. He resigned from office, and the lieutenant governor took office as governor, and Governor Hochul said, God wants you to be vaccinated. He made the smartest men and women, the scientists, the doctors, the researchers, he made them come up with a vaccine that is from God to us, and we must say, thank you, God. Telling constituents Jesus would want them to get vaccinated. So I think, depending on how you look at this, the governor's comments could be construed as animus. You could distinguish that from the regulator sitting behind their desk at the New York State Department of Health that says, we're going to make a good law. We're gonna define a really good policy here. And we don't want people to opt out. We want people to get vaccinated. So according to Jacobson, we will allow a medical exemption, but that is all. And they're not in any way sort of trying to interpret whether or not anyone is entitled to a religious exemption, but here you have the governor making public statements. So that could potentially be problematic. But I also question whether it shows animus and undermines the law's neutrality, or if this is something akin to, under Title VII, an employer denying an insincere request. If you read the statements, I don't think on their face they show animus, but I could see the argument. So again, the court denied certiorari, and nevertheless, in a dissent joined by Justices Alito and Gorsuch, Justice Thomas highlighted whether such laws, highlighted the aforementioned circuit split and questioned whether such laws are neutral or generally applicable, and of course trotted out the same reasoning that I shared in Justice Gorsuch's dissent in the Doe v. Mills case, suggesting that strict scrutiny should be applied in these cases. So while these questions have yet to come before the court on a full merits review, I think we can foresee the direction in which we are headed under the current court. If a majority of the court were to accept Justice Gorsuch's reasoning, I could see Jacobson being revisited, and the state's use of police powers in both a pandemic and non-pandemic context could be curtailed potentially. As we see the reemergence of polio in our country, I think the challenge comes into sharp relief. Thank you.
We happily do have time for questions. Before we get to the questions, a brief commercial announcement. The CLE code is AM16. It's like the old days in church, right? It's bingo time. It's AM16. Please write this code down and retain it for your records. You will be asked to submit this code at the conclusion of the event in order to receive CLE credit. Is that good enough?
I do want to say for ADA purposes, we're also required to show it.
Oh,
So I don't know if this is getting picked up on the camera. We had a slide, I thought.
I think it was. It was right there.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure if it's, I can see the green thing.
All right, so between those, I think.
AM16. So now we have some time for questions. Anybody who would like to ask a question, please so indicate, stand up and speak loudly.
Two questions. One from Ms. Curran, whether Roman Catholic canon law is it applicable to Catholics? And if so, does it say anything on the subject we're talking about? And the second question for Mr. Hughes is, does it appear that the U.S. Supreme Court is ignoring the Establishment Clause, and to the whole panel, if religion is by law placed on a higher pedestal, is that creating a problem for the country, because the Establishment Clause was meant to reduce reduce the threat of factionalism and sectarianism in our country?
Thank you. So I'm not a canon lawyer. Canon law generally refers to internal church issues. So I'm not aware of any way that canon law would apply. I can't say there isn't some way. And all the reading and work I've done around vaccine and Catholic teaching over the last couple of years, I've never once come across a reference to something in canon law that's relevant.
I think that you raised a great argument for some potential amici if this case comes before the Supreme Court. I don't necessarily think that the current court would agree that it raises an Establishment Clause issue, but if we look back at the 1979 Brown decision in Mississippi, the Boone v. Bozeman case in Arkansas, now those were very much lower courts. But we should all go take a look at some of that reasoning and arguments, because I think that would come in handy if the case came before the court. But I don't think that the current court would agree with that line of argument.
Yes, well, young man with the striped tie.
But the question I have is follow on the set up the free exercise clause, constitutional grounds, getting involved in the statutory, Title VII of state or city law on the accommodation process, and the distinction between exemption and accommodation. So some of you mentioned the legal employers support the vaccine, and certainly Catholic faith responds Christian faith as well. Tell that vaccine is acceptable in the adoption. But how do you handle an employee who says, I have an individual who works for you? I have a sincere belief that I disagree with the employers for the Catholic churches or the Islamic religion's position. Do you accommodate with that? Or is it, what's that process? And you receive to these right?
Yeah, we talked about this the other evening, and I agree with your perspective on this. So, you have a situation that he's describing where there's a state mandate that applies to healthcare workers. Healthcare organizations have to administer that policy, right? So they're not only trying to adhere to a state mandate, but they have an institutional policy requiring vaccination, and under Title VII, they're obligated to entertain an accommodation, right? And I think, I would think that the Title VII process would have to supersede, anything that the state is doing on the exemption side. And yeah, I would think so. Yeah.
I'm direct on employers. When you had employees working with you, and they said, I don't want to take the vaccine, whether it's fired, or accommodations, or what was the process? Share that with us to make that decision whether or not there would be an accommodation.
So Catholic hospitals, as you said, across the country were subject to the mandates. And as employers, they had processes in place to allow people to apply for religious accommodation and exemption. I'm not privy to how all of those turned out. I know that there was, how can I put this? I don't think folks were terribly eager to grant religious exemptions, wanted to comply with the law, wanted to comply with, public health and with, their ethicist, because all Catholic hospitals have ethicists, their ethicist telling them there's no moral objection to receiving vaccines. I'm sure there were employees who chose to not get vaccinated and left the employment of some Catholic employers. I can't give you quotes, but I would be surprised if that didn't happen. Certainly, it put Catholic hospitals in a very difficult position, but they wanted their people vaccinated.
Yes.
I have a question about the medical exemptions. So we heard yesterday in one of the panels about how there's been widespread fraud with medical exemptions, particularly in California, and how there's been an effort to sort of crack down on that. And I was wondering if that effort is happening anywhere else where, there is an effort to make the medical exemption more serious and more rigorous and maybe make it more comparable to whatever the religious exemption process is, which theoretically should also be serious and rigorous, so that both are kind of on equal footing. I'm just wondering what the landscape is.
Yeah, it goes back to the variability that I mentioned in state policies, and some states have gotten really serious over the years. I haven't looked at this admittedly in a while, been about a decade, but some states got really, really serious about the veracity of the process. Rhode Island, for example, years ago, probably still do require people to come to the health department. Rhode Island's a very small state, so you can have people, go to the health department and watch a video, and they're required to do that before they're allowed to get the exemption. The form and the provider type and the evidence required and all those things are going to vary significantly by state. But if you're allowing any licensed health professional in the state to sign the form and the form's not very rigorous, it's very easy to game that. I agree.
I have a sort of a working theory that the protection of religion envisioned in the Constitution and the Establishment Clause also goes towards preventing people from making insincere faith claims because those are destructive of the respect that is given to religion in the first place. So people are allowed to say, historically, you find people say, I can't pay taxes because it's against my religion, or someone established a church of marijuana because they were marijuana laws. So, well, now my religion dictates that I have to do this. People have historically done that, and that is to the denigration of the practice of religion generally. And I'm wondering if that is something, if there's a legal argument that can be framed around that, around kind of a duty to protect sincerely practiced religion from insincere efforts by people who want to say, for example, at the end of the day, I buy into whatever conspiracy theories are about microchips or about vaccines being unsafe and the government hiding that sort. And I don't have a medical basis to get out of it, but I can claim that I have a religious objection, and there are people who tell me how to frame it in some doctrinal sounding terms. Can that be argued as a legal basis for rejecting a religious objection?
I think we should explore that together. I think it would take courts being willing to wade in and really scrutinize the sincerity of religious beliefs, which they've not been willing to do. The affirmative duty argument is really interesting under, parens patriae and the interpretation that there's no affirmative duty, right? I had a professor years ago that tried to argue that there was with respect to vaccine mandates. We could look that back up. But I think that those types of novel arguments, again, would be useful for Amici if these cases come before the court. Yeah.
Wouldn't that be the case?
Say more about that.
The issue that we need to be an exemption is that animal sacrifices.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm just trying to understand the application of. Yeah. Yeah. So there we had the local ordinance. They're very clearly targeting the ritual sacrifice, but they did it under the guise of, animal cruelty. In the peyote case, there was no, it was actually a controlled substances law, and it just happened to, it didn't target that activity, but.
Violations in that ordinance statute. But as your marijuana case, if marijuana is illegal, and so your marijuana, then probably
Yeah,
I just
Gar-
speak with Professor Rice earlier, discussing the definition of religion, and and I forget how she described it in one case, but if you define it broadly enough that it can be a comprehensive system that makes sense, I mean, that might be in part a way of addressing this, because it's going to be hard for just somebody ad hoc come up with a comprehensive system, a worldview that might fit a reasonable definition. That might be a way of avoiding some of the problems.
I know Dory wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, I want to ask.
Yeah.
So this is I'm pretty sure that all religions would say lying to get out of vaccine, lying about a religion to get out of vaccine is wrong. But has there been any pronouncement of that, or is that so obvious that to your knowledge, that nobody bothered to actually say it? I think this is not a legal question. Is from your experience, has any religious authority said, don't lie about our religion it's morally wrong, or is it so?
Well, lying, and in Catholic teaching, lying is a mortal sin. about anything. Okay, so, which isn't to say we don't all lie, because we all do in little ways, right? So, and sometimes big ways. So I can't quote you a particular ethicist or theologian or bishop or priest who said lying about the COVID-19 vaccine is evil and a sin, but lying is considered a mortal sin in Catholic teaching.
I think the problem with the question is not whether you would find some religious authority to criticize a statement. The problem would be what would that authority do about it? With respect to your point, Brian, one of the issues with the sincerity question is finding a judge willing to take a stand on the question. I clerked for a federal judge back in the day, and I'm pretty sure he would have figured out some way not to resolve that question. So, so we might have a minute or so, 1 minute, one last question? Yeah.
I was just gonna say, from my research on this, the only area where I ever found willing to entertain sincerity was with the draft. There, a decision had to be made, right? You can't just open the door for anybody to come out and say, I've got an objection or the draft. Meetings, right? So to have a draft, or reviews on a draft, you have to be very careful about drawing the lines about what counts. But it still wasn't, it didn't feel principled. I'm drawing a blank on the names of the cases, but it still didn't feel principled because courts are unwilling to assess that counts as a lie versus not. Your understanding of your religious beliefs versus the Pope's beliefs versus the judge's beliefs wading into that. You know, they put First Amendment on this pedestal because it's this problem, but the only place where I really ever saw the courts have to make some assessment was in military trials.
That's interesting, and maybe we should revisit to think about some of these novel arguments to be made. You know, Jacobson, the quote that I read from Justice Harlan, actually was referring to the draft.
This was in the 70s, so
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
the Vietnam draft. This was way after Jacobson.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, if I might, I clerked during the Vietnam War, and we had a huge number of objectors, and I didn't see any judges in the Northern District of Illinois inquire as to the sincerity. I'm not saying it didn't happen elsewhere. I'm just saying my experience was if someone asserted it, there it was. But I think our time is up. I want to thank Richard, Mustafa, and Kathy for making a wonderful panel. And to all of you for coming to this interesting discussion. Thank you very much.